So right now, I would like to introduce our speaker. That's why you're here this morning, and we're very excited. Timothy Renick is the Senior Vice President for Student Success, and he's also Professor of Religious Studies at Georgia State University. There, he has served as Chair of the Department of Religious Studies and also Director of the Honors Program. And since 2008, he's directed the student success and enrollment efforts of the university, overseeing among the fastest improving graduation rates in the nation and elimination of all achievement gaps based on students' race, ethnicity, or income level. And I think that is quite impressive. Dr. Renick has testified on strategies for helping university students succeed before the United States Senate and has twice been invited to the White House. His work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time, and CNN, and he's been cited by former President Obama. He was named one of 2016's most innovative people in higher education by Washington Monthly. He was the recipient of the 2015-16 Award for National Leadership in Student Success Innovation, and also awarded the 2018 McGraw Prize in Higher Education. He's currently principal investigator for a $9 million U.S. Department of Education grant to study the impact of predictive analytics-based advisement on 10,000 low-income and first-generation students nationally. A summa cum laude graduate of Dartmouth College, Dr. Renick holds an MA and PhD in religion from Princeton University. I think he has a lot of good to talk to us about today. So thank you, and please welcome Dr. Renick.
Thank you, Sandra. Good morning. Let me give me just a second here to get this set up. I don't know, it may be just me, but it would seem to me that each and every haunted tour would be dangerous. I mean, it's... Great. Well, it is an honor to be here today. Thank you for having me, Sandra. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks to all of you in advance for the important work you do. I'm going to tell you a story about one institution this morning, but I hope the lessons will be applicable to your own context, be usable in your home campuses, and some of the larger themes and lessons we've learned at Georgia State will be useful for your purposes. I'm going to start, though, with some national data because I want to underline the importance of the work that goes on in this room and across the nation in student success. These data are from the New York Times. This is the percent of Americans who actually hold the bachelor's degree. The numbers are disaggregated by economic quartile. So this chart covers the last 40 years from 1970 to the present. Far left is 1970, tracking forward. And what you can see, even if you're in the back of the room, is there have been significant changes in college attainment over the last generation, but entirely in the upper half of the economic spectrum. So if you're among the 25% wealthiest Americans, back in 1970, you had about a 40% chance of having a bachelor's degree. Now that's up over 80%. We should all celebrate that. That's great progress in a relatively short period of time. But that's not the story of most of your campuses. It's certainly not the story of Georgia State. Most of our students sit in the bottom lines in the chart, especially that red line, the bottom 25% of Americans by annual household income. And as you can clearly see, the prospects for success there are much different, and the results have been very sobering. In fact, there's been little change over the last 40 years, and what you can see visually here is the gap between the wealthiest and least wealthy Americans is not getting narrower. It's actually doubled over the last 40 years. So you take those national data, add to them these, that over the last 6 or 7 years, we've crossed an important threshold in the United States. For the first time since these data have been collected, the majority of K through 12 public school children across the United States now qualify as low income. In fact, you can draw a line roughly from California to the DC area. Almost every state south of that line has already crossed the 50% threshold, meaning the majority of K through 12 public school children are low income. Some states, like my state of Georgia, are already above 60%. So you put these two pieces together, it should give all of us pause, because we as a nation have not figured out at scale how to graduate low-income students. We've gotten much better at admitting them. Access has improved over the last 40 years, but the success rates have not in a significant fashion. And yet the majority of students working their way through the pipeline nationally, at least the public school pipeline, are low income. This is a good introduction to my home campus, Georgia State University. This is not just a pretty picture of the Atlanta skyline. That white building on the right is our largest academic building, our business school beside it, one of our classroom buildings in that picture. We're just mixed into the downtown fabric of Atlanta, no fenced-off campus and so forth. If you've ever been to a major conference in downtown Atlanta, you probably walk through parts of Georgia State because we're about 3 or 4 blocks south of the big convention hotels there. 35,000 students on this campus alone. As I'll talk a little bit more towards the end of my presentation this morning, we were consolidated by the state of Georgia with the largest community college about 3.5 years ago. So we are now 53,000 students across the various campuses, 6 campuses spread around the metro area. You know, the reality is Georgia State has not been well known historically. We are not the University of Georgia, the big football powerhouse and flagship. We're not also Georgia Tech, which is only about 1.5 miles away from us, the very elite public institution that often is ranked in the top 10 publics in the nation. If there's any claim to fame Georgia State has historically, it may be our geography. We have the uncommon, it may even be a unique distinction for a big public university, to have our campus bisected by a National Park Service historic district. The Martin Luther King District, celebrating the life and the work of the Reverend Martin Luther King, splits our campus in half. The office I work in every morning is about 4 blocks away from that brick building at the bottom of the screen. That's Ebenezer Baptist Church, where the Reverend King and his father before him were head pastor. His grave site is right there off the street in downtown Atlanta, and then his childhood home where he was born as well, that kind of yellowish colored house at the top of the screen. So at Georgia State, we're living and working every day in this geography that is infused with historical significance. But for much of our history, Georgia State did not live up to that legacy. For one thing, you know, we were a segregated campus well into the 1960s. I pulled these pictures from the Georgia State University archives. And, you know, this is what campus looked like when the Reverend King was preaching and doing his groundbreaking civil rights work that ultimately led to the Nobel Peace Prize. You know, we were 3 or 4 blocks away from where he was preaching, and we were the embodiment of what he was fighting against. And then much more recently than the 1960s, Georgia State was still grossly underperforming overall, but especially with regard to our students of color. These were our IPED 6-year graduation rates as recently as 15 years ago. So this is 2003. Overall, our graduation rates hovered around 30%, and we were a poster child for the achievement gaps, equity gaps. Year after year, semester after semester, our white students would outperform our students of color. Our middle and upper income students would outperform our low income students. You could just bank on it. That's the way it was going to be. And what makes Georgia State's story, I hope, interesting, maybe a little inspirational for your purposes this morning, is that what happened to Georgia State in the 15 years since these numbers were locked in would not on the surface suggest, at least to the pundits, that Georgia State would be the site of a student success turnaround. For one thing, we were going through significant demographic changes over the last 15 years. I've been at Georgia State over 30 years. As you heard in the introduction, I'm a faculty member in religious studies. When I arrived at Georgia State in the late 1980s, it was a majority white institution. 70% of the student body was white. But as you know, the South and Atlanta in particular have gone through significant demographic changes in recent years. And a little over a decade ago, we became designated an MSI, a minority serving institution by the federal government. And every year since then, we've gotten more and more diverse. So to the point where this institution that was early in my career 70% white is now over 70% non-white. There's no longer any majority population at Georgia State. Our largest single group is our African American students of about 39%. Our 2 fastest growing groups are our Hispanic and our Asian populations. So you take these demographic shifts and add to them these. The other thing that's gone on over the last 15 years is that our students have gotten a lot less well-resourced financially. So the recession hit Atlanta very hard. It was a boom city before the recession. At one point during the recession, among all metro areas across the United States, Atlanta simultaneously had the highest unemployment rate and the highest default rate on home mortgages. And when those kind of economic downturns occur, they don't distribute equally across the population, right? The demographics show that the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia Tech and the University of Georgia tend to be middle, upper income, and upper income families. And while I'm sure they lost wealth during that time period, they were not predominantly the families losing homes and jobs. Those were the families that send their sons and daughters to Georgia State. First generation to go to college, first generation Americans, a lot of immigrant families, low income families, and so forth. So what you can see in this chart is literally over a 4-year period, we almost doubled the number of Pell students we enroll at Georgia State. We went from a campus that was under a third of our population Pell eligible to a campus that became, and it still is, almost 60% Pell eligible. It's not going to be business as usual. You know, to put this in some kind of perspective, this fall at Georgia State, we're enrolling 28,900 Pell students, one institution. The entire Ivy League combined this fall is enrolling about 9,800 Pell students. So Georgia State is trying to educate 3 times the number of low-income students as the entire Ivy League. It's going to take a different mindset. And one of the themes you're going to hear from me this morning is it's a mindset that doesn't lend itself well to our usual tactic in higher education. When you've got a problem, create a program, right? Create some targeted program to deal with the issue at hand. Our colleagues up the street at Georgia Tech, and I'm not belittling this at all because it works for them, they admit a few hundred Pell students every summer, and they have a bridge program for a couple weeks before the fall term begins for those couple hundred incoming Pell students. And you can do that when you have a couple hundred Pell students. When you have 28,900 Pell students, you don't create a program for them. You have to change the institution at its core and the way it behaves for all its students. And if there's anything distinctive about what Georgia State has done over the past decade, it's that. It's when we've found problems and made corrections or offered solutions, we've scaled these solutions across the whole student body. A couple other details about the last 15 years just to set the context. One of the details is we have not been getting more selective. Just the opposite. We have, over the 15-year period, significantly broadened our admissions criteria. Here I'm not yet even talking about the community college we consolidated with. I'm talking about our bachelor's admissions to the Atlanta campus. Our SAT scores are down significantly. There would be many vice presidents that wouldn't want to stand up in front of a screen in a big public session talking about the plunging SAT scores. But it's not in any way an embarrassment for us. It's exactly what we planned for. The state of Georgia came to us a decade ago and said, we have a problem. It's getting so competitive to get into the flagships, and Georgia really has 2 flagships, University of Georgia and Georgia Tech, that it's not clear what's going to happen to the rest of the students. You know, you're telling all these high school students, don't drop out, get your diploma, take your college prep classes, take the ACT or SAT, apply to college, and then at Georgia Tech this fall, the average incoming SAT score is around a 1460. So you have to be in the top 1% of SAT takers across the United States to have an average chance of getting into Georgia Tech. At the University of Georgia, the average high school GPA for incoming freshmen this fall is above a 4.0. So you have to be an A-plus student and among the top 3% of high school graduates in Georgia to have an average chance of getting into the University of Georgia. What happens to the rest? So the state came to us and said, are you willing to grow? We're the other large, comprehensive 4-year institution in Georgia, research institution. Are you willing to grow? And so what we've been doing for the last at least 6-7 years is admitting all qualified candidates. Our admissions criteria, our process is pretty simple. If you basically have a B average, you've done your college prep classes, you're in, and we'll grow to accommodate you. And so the fact that our SAT scores are down is in no way some form of embarrassment for us. Last detail in just setting the stage, and this won't come as a surprise to any of you, is we're doing it with fewer resources, at least fewer state resources. I'll talk about some ROI issues a little later on in my presentation. But the reality is, because the recession hit Georgia hard, the tax base plunged, we lost about $40 million in appropriations. Under these circumstances, the ones I'm just sketching now, it's easy to point fingers, right? It's very easy to blame K through 12 in Georgia. Our SAT scores are going down. When K through 12 starts preparing students better for college, then our graduation rates will go up. Or blame the state, for cutting our appropriations, $8 million, $10 million a year, year after year. When the states get serious about supporting us, we'll turn our success numbers around. But what Georgia State did a decade ago was something that initially was a little uncomfortable and then somewhat liberating. We asked a different question. Are we the problem? If 7 out of 10 students are coming to Georgia State, dropping out with debt and nothing to show for it, whose fault is it? Sure, it'd be better if the K through 12 system produced better prepared students, and sure, it would be great if the state gave us more money. But clearly there must be some things we're doing that are contributing to these atrociously high attrition rates. What are we doing that makes us an accomplice in this problem? So even as we were getting cut in state appropriations, we began investing in data talent, data consulting, and almost exclusively turned the mirror on ourselves, looked at ourselves via the data, and asked this question about what obstacles we had created. The logic behind this is simple. I have very little control over K through 12 in Georgia. And it's a very long proposition to get the math and reading, preparation of our incoming students to improve. I also have little control over state appropriations and the political processes. But I have a lot of control over what practices, procedures, and policies we follow at Georgia State, what we do to admit students, how we support them, how we guide them, how we advise them, and so forth. So that's exactly what we turned our attention to. We began to analyze our own shortcomings and then use the data to introduce interventions, introduce new initiatives, track the data very carefully, perfect the intervention, and when we found something that worked, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have scaled. And just about every program that I'm going to describe this morning is scaled across the whole Georgia State student body. It's not just targeted for Pell students or first-generation students and so forth. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes is give you some practical examples, hopefully useful ones for your own context at your home institutions. In each case, I'm going to start with the data point that we discovered in our own data that showed the problems we were creating for our students, and then I'll describe how we tried to intervene. First example, 19%. 19% was the percent of our confirmed freshman class as recently as 4 years ago who never showed up for their studies at Georgia State. This is what is commonly called the summer melt rate. I know most in this room are familiar, but just to underline the distinction, this is not the same as a yield rate or the loss that happens when you admit students and some of the students end up going to other institutions. This is far more insidious. These are students who do everything right. They finish high school with a diploma, they take the ACT, SAT, they apply to college, they get into college, they confirm they're going to college. In this case, most of these students had come to our orientation and had signed up for classes. But classes began, and they were nowhere to be found. So we asked a database question. What happened to these students? We used National Student Clearinghouse to track the 2,015 students who had melted away for an entire 12-month period. Maybe they just didn't tell us. Maybe they went on to a local community college, or maybe they went on to Georgia Tech, and we just didn't hear about it. But what we found, which is very sobering, is that 12 months after these students were fully admitted, confirmed, and prepared to start at a 4-year research institution, almost 300 of them hadn't attended a single day of post-secondary work anywhere across the U.S. They had just melted away. They had turned from college goers to individuals sitting out the whole college experience. And look at the profile of these students. Mostly low income, mostly students of color, exactly the students we need to succeed with as a nation. But something's happening during those summer months, kind of the 3 to 4 months between finishing high school and starting college, that is causing these students to change their mind. And when we talk about the equity gaps, You know, these are the origins, right? I mean, this is before the first day of class, before they even set foot on campus to begin their studies, and already the low income and the students of color and so forth are leaving us at higher rates. So what is the something that changed their minds in those 3 to 4 months? I think we all know the answer in this room. You know, it's us. It's us at Georgia State. It's all of us in higher education who create this immense bureaucracy that we expect students to navigate in order to be ready for the first day of class. So we did a survey, an analysis of all the bureaucratic steps we require our incoming freshmen to complete between finishing high school and starting their first day of classes with us. And embarrassingly, we found there are about 14 different things we require students to do. And you know many of them, right? The FAFSA, I won't go into the details because we're all so aware of that, but it's basically a glorified IRS tax form, and no 18-year-old is going to complete that on their own, at least with very high success rates. We've become a lot more familiar with the verification process since we started these analyses. Just like the IRS uses algorithms to pull certain tax returns for audits, so too, I think as most of you know, the Department of Education uses algorithms to pull out certain of the FAFSA returns for verification for additional information. And so what you have literally happening in July of before the freshman year is some first-generation student gets a letter from the federal government or an email saying, we see on your FAFSA you declared your grandmother as your legal guardian and claim that your biological parents are not contributing to the finances of your family. Please provide written verification of your grandmother's status. And we all know how this works. In low-income families, it's not like they're going to lawyers and filling out paperwork. Mom and dad are gone, grandma takes over. And the student says, I don't have written verification, knows his grandmother doesn't have written verification, says, well, if the federal government's saying I need that in order to go to college, guess what? Not going to college after all. Or the state of Georgia requires immunization of all incoming public university students. And it makes sense from a public health perspective, but I can tell you, and we've drilled down in the data and seen it, it's a big differentiator when it comes to students from different economic backgrounds. Because the middle and upper income students are not going to give that request a second thought, right? It's not that they're more empowered or more effective at navigating bureaucracy. They're more effective about handing the request to mom and dad who send their records in. But if you're that first-generation student being raised by your grandmother, again, you know you don't have immunization records. You know your grandmother doesn't have your immunization records. And Georgia State's writing saying, before you can register for classes, we need your immunizations to show you've been immunized for measles and so forth. And so another subset of the students take the request, stick it in their pocket, say, guess I'm not going to college after all. So for the next cycle, which was the summer of 2016, we changed in some relatively low-cost ways the way we support students through that 3-month period after high school graduation. The first thing we did is we created a survey that we deliver to all our admitted students on their smart devices. They get this as soon as they're admitted to the university. On the survey, we ask all the questions you would never ask or could never legally ask on a college application. Do you have a disability? Are you working? How many hours? Do you actually work and contribute to the finances of your family every week? Because a lot of our students are not just trying to save money to pay for their education, but they're also supporting the living expenses of their household and so forth. What class in high school did you love? What class in high school did you hate? The whole point is to begin to develop a personalized communication flow with our students from the first moment they're admitted to the university. The second thing we did is we created a portal. The portal takes the students through those 14 bureaucratic steps I was describing. It's all color-coded. As they complete a step, it changes color, and there are resources available on the page to help them navigate some of these issues. The biggest change to me, and this should ring positively for a group that loves data like all of you do, is the biggest change is I finally have data that shows me what was tripping up our students. For years, I knew there were students who were engaged, and then we stopped hearing from them. Now I know there are students who are engaged up until the point we say asked for their immunization records, and then we stopped hearing from them. So I can reach out with much more specific help to that student. See that you may be having some problems, how can we help? In fact, collecting the data has made significant changes with our practices at Georgia State. We offer about 38 freshman orientations over the course of June, July, and August. So students come in groups of 250 at a time and spend the day and register for classes and so forth. I'm happy to say this summer, for the first time, we contracted with a mobile health unit. It parked outside orientation every one of those 38 sessions, and it was available to provide free immunizations for any students who needed them. You know, it doesn't make any sense to send a low-income student back home saying, oh yeah, you need to get immunized for measles, like that student's going to go through the Rolodex and find the local physicians and so forth and be able to finance it. And as I'll argue in a little bit, some of these simple steps, which your first reaction on campus might be, how do you ever afford that? The real question is, how do we not afford to do so? Not just for moral reasons, but even for fiscal reasons. You invest in a measles immunization, and the student who's going to walk away from your campus then spends 4 years with you paying tuition and fees. It's a no-brainer, and yet we're so short-sighted in many instances. The third thing we did for the summer of 2016, and this is the one that probably had the biggest impact, it's certainly the one that's gotten the most attention, is we became one of the first schools in the country to launch an AI-enhanced chatbot for student success purposes. What's a chatbot? It's an automatic texting platform. What we did is we built up a knowledge base of over 2,000 text-based answers to the questions our incoming students commonly ask. Questions about registration and housing and the verification process and financial aid and immunizations and all these sorts of things. And what we did is we worked with a tech partner, AdmitHub, who's one of the vendors who's here today, to take those 2,000 text-based answers and put them on a smart device. It's not an app. We didn't want it to be an app because we didn't want our students to have to sign on to something special to get access to this tool. They just go onto their regular texting function on their smart devices, begin a conversation with Pounce. That's Pounce right there. It's our Panther, our school mascot. And after that point, they can communicate with Pounce 24/7, ask whatever question they want. The AI does not write the answer to the questions. Our legal office would have none of that some AI is going to be producing official Georgia State responses. What the AI does when the text comes in is goes to the knowledge base and uses algorithms to pull out the correct response, or makes a determination that there's not a reliable response already in the knowledge base, in which case the AI takes the question and delivers it to a staff person who writes an answer, vets it, and then adds it to the knowledge base, so it's constantly getting smarter. I said we launched with about 2,000, and now we're three and a half years later, we have, I think, about 3,800 answers in the knowledge base. So how does this look, or how does this work? Here's a really simple example, but it's an actual example. You know, we prompt a question from a student in this instance saying, are you planning to bring a car to campus so we can make sure that they take care of their parking issues and so forth? The student answers no, and you say, great, hope you have a good semester, you know, good luck. If the student answers yes, you begin to give some information. Here's how you sign up for a parking pass. There's nothing particularly surprising or new about any of that. In fact, many of us have had FAQs on our websites for a decade that do something very similar to that. Where the AI comes in is when the conversation is a more complicated one. This is the chart of what it looks like when a student raises a question about financial aid. And depending upon how the student answers yes or no, yes, I'm on Pell, no, I'm not, yes, I have a state scholarship, no, I don't, yes, I'm in a single parent, you know, the whole conversation is very different. But what the AI is able to do is personalize that conversation and give the student the information they need. We had looked at some platforms that nudge, and I don't belittle nudging at all. We also use nudges at Georgia State. But what we found once we launched the chatbot is the following. That, you know, you'd nudge somebody and say, the deadline for the FAFSA is coming up next Tuesday, and think you've done your job, and then be frustrated when the student doesn't turn in the FAFSA on time. Aren't they lazy, or why aren't they taking more initiative? What the chatbot shows is, in many cases, the response is, I know the deadline's next Tuesday. They want my biological father's signature, and I haven't seen my biological father for the last 18 months. What do I do in those circumstances? So we're actually able to respond to the obstacles that are truly in front of the students. All of this is done in a very irreverent fashion. We use emojis. If I had loaded some video, you would have seen that dog actually typing the response on his laptop. But, you know, symbols, so forth. The whole thing is projected. It is Pounce, our mascot, speaking. to the students so that Pounce remains their friend, as you can see in the top right. If they're asking a question about financial aid, it's not that Pounce is financial aid, because we don't want him necessarily to be blended with the two. He says, my friends in financial aid tell me that this is the way to go about solving this particular problem. And so when we launched in June of 2016, we had Lindsay Page of the University of Pittsburgh running a random control trial for us right from the start. We estimated that maybe we would have 5,000 to 6,000 questions answered in the 3 months leading up to the start of fall classes, just for our incoming freshman class. In those 3 months, just for our incoming freshman class, we had 185,000 questions answered. Average response time was about 6 seconds. What we saw in the data was revealing. One thing we saw, it remains true to this morning, is that the usage of the chatbot is heavier at 1 a.m. than it is at 9 a.m. Kind of the silent indictment of all of our practices. We're closed down tight when the students are asking the questions, and we're happy to open every morning at 8:30 when few of them are around. Well, the chatbot is there 24/7. More soberingly, we did focus groups with the students after that first summer and sat down and talked about their experience, and we had multiple students concede to us that they asked the chatbot questions they wouldn't have asked a human being. If you can't get your father to sign the FAFSA because you haven't seen him for the last 18 months, the last thing you want to do is truck on down to some stranger's office and spill out your personal history to that person. And what the students told us is they knew it was a bot. They liked the fact that there was no judgment here. They didn't have to be embarrassed about asking a stupid or dumb question, that no questions are dumb for Pounce. He responds with enthusiasm and a cheerful attitude, and the students get the information they need and are able to move on. And has it made an impact from a results perspective, these relatively simple changes that we've introduced? It's made a big impact. In the 3 years since we've launched these changes and did our analysis, we've reduced summer melt at Georgia State by 37%. That's over 350 students, mostly first-generation students of color, who are in their seats ready to go the first day of classes, who a few years earlier were sitting out the college experience in its entirety. And because it's worked so well for our incoming freshmen, we have a grant from the Dell and ECMC foundations to roll out the use of the chatbot for our whole student body, all our continuing students. The questions don't end once the first day of classes begin, and so rather than shutting off the chatbot now, we are building out the knowledge base. It has to be obviously much broader to answer all the questions that continuing students have. And again, we used Lindsay Page of the University of Pittsburgh to run random control trials, and you can see some of the results. The impact has not been seen in kind of life decisions, helping a student change a major. That the chatbot is not the vehicle to do that. But when it comes to transactional items, which we all know in this room can be the difference between a student staying enrolled or not, the chatbot has proven extremely effective. Removing holds from one account, coming in and signing for loans, coming to see an academic advisor in a timely fashion. We're seeing 30, 40, even close to 50% better behavior from the students who are on the chatbot from those who are not. Second example, the thing we saw in our data that was problematic. Here's a sobering number as well. 2.6. 2.6 was the number of majors that our average graduating bachelor student was going through as recently as about 8 years ago. 2.5 majors. If you enroll low-income students, that number is a disaster. Because every time a student changes major, they're creating added credit hours, wasted credit hours, added time to degree, added debt load, and a subset are dropping out with no degree whatsoever. And when you pause to think about it, at least when we paused to think about it, again, we had to admit that we were the problem. Our brochures broadcast the fact that we offer over 100 different academic majors and fields for our undergraduate students. This fall at Georgia State, we have 4,000 course sections on the books. And in our infinite wisdom, for generations, we would bring students in for orientation in a room about half this size, about 250 at a time, stand up in front of them, and tell them, pick. Pick something. Pick a major, pick 5 or 6 classes, it'll all work out. Well, they were compliant and they would pick, but it didn't work out. We got exactly the results we could expect. from a student body that is largely low-income first generation. You put 100 choices in front of them, and they have no clue about most of them. They say, what happened? I'm going to be an accountant. That sounds like a good idea. So I'll take 2 semesters of prerequisite courses, get into my first accounting class, and you know how this ends. 3 weeks in, oh, this isn't what I thought it would be at all. I'm going to switch majors. And we weren't helping the student be any more informed the second time either, and so they'd pick marketing, and then and pretty soon they had wasted thousands of dollars of their aid and eligibility, and in many cases sealed their fate as a non-graduating student. So we've totally changed the way we onboard all of our incoming students at Georgia State. Across Perimeter College, our community college, but also our Atlanta campus now, every single incoming freshman is in a learning community. Old model, I know. Our model, just to give you the details, is it's opt-out only. Students are in unless they show a reason why they shouldn't be in. Groups of 25 students travel in all their first semester classes together. We all know the national data shows low-income students drop out of college disproportionately, in part because they feel like they don't belong. And at places like Georgia State, we historically have created a perfect recipe for a student feeling like they don't belong. If with 4,000 course sections, if you leave it to chance and a student signs up for 5 or 6 classes for their first semester, in all likelihood, they won't see the same face twice, right? They won't see anybody more than once all through their fall semester. So we don't leave it to chance anymore. We make sure that the students are in groups of 25 students who travel in all their classes together. We can't afford to cap the enrollments at 25. In some cases, the class sections are 75. But at least there'll be 24 familiar faces, friends, partners, people you can study with. If you missed a class, somebody you can get notes from and catch up with and so forth. Just from that structure alone, which literally costs us next to nothing. We have 1/2 FTE who organizes all the block schedules for the learning communities. But it's the same courses, same size, same numbers, and so forth. We saw a significant gain in first year GPA and first year retention rates. But to deal with the problem of students bouncing between majors, what we started doing 7 years ago now is organizing all the learning communities around career pathways, or what we call meta majors. So we don't put any pressure on incoming Georgia State students any longer to pick among the 100 different majors we offer. Let's find a general area of interest. Are you interested in STEM or the arts or business? If so, we find 24 other students who share your interests. That helps us focus the courses the students take during that first semester. But much more importantly, it helps us direct programming to the students because they're registered in an organized fashion. So for each of the learning communities, a faculty member from that meta major will teach a 1-hour orientation course, which becomes an orientation to the field. A business faculty member will teach an orientation class for the business learning communities. They'll host open houses, so the students will be invited during the semester to go meet the faculty in accounting and marketing and finance and risk management, learn about the fields. They'll do alumni panels. The whole point is to give the students a fighting chance to make an informed decision about what they want to do, instead of leaving it all up to happenstance and luck. And then we've created another portal. This portal scrapes the Atlanta job listings every morning for live job data. And for whatever career the student is interested in this example, it's nursing, they can see for that morning how many jobs are listed in Metro Atlanta. What's the starting salary if you have an associate's degree? What's the starting salary if you have a bachelor's degree? But like Netflix or Amazon that say you like these books or movies, you might like these others, we say to the student, well, if you like nursing, you might like these other careers we have in health professions. We offer degrees in health informatics and health management and radiologic technology. And here's all the job data, the salaries, and how many jobs are available for the students. Every advising session that we have with students uses this tool. So when students are talking about majors and courses, they're also getting some connection to the job market and the opportunities beyond graduation. To get our faculty involved in helping students pick majors, we created a seed grant program. It's now only about 2 years old, but it's been very effective and cost-effective as well. We give small grants to faculty members so that within their existing classes, they can create interesting assignments that get students to think about the career competencies they're learning in that class. You've already heard I'm a faculty member in religious studies. I can attest that every national ranking of the least practical majors, religious studies is always 1 or 2 on the list. But I believe to this day, and it's been a little while since I've taught full-time in the classroom, I did teach for 20 years full-time, I believe that religious studies is really useful to students. In point of fact, religious studies majors do very well career-wise and income-wise, but they're learning. There's a lot of writing, there's a lot of thinking, there's a lot of communication, oral communication. They're learning about different worldviews, motivations for people, so they understand people in particularly perceptive ways and so forth. But I must admit, despite the fact that I really believe that I don't remember any time in 20 years of teaching when I paused the class and said, for the next session, let's just talk about the kind of competencies you're learning that are going to be of value once you leave the classroom. Instead, what I try to do is jam just a little more content, into a session. So what we now have is this a systematic program. This is a real example on the screen. One of our largest classes at Georgia State is an intro class in U.S. history, about 8,000 seats a year. And the faculty who teach that class came together and said, we'll create an assignment. Now, in every section of U.S. history at Georgia State, students are given a primary data set of historical data. They're exposed to, brought to computer labs and taught data visualization tools like Tableau. And one of their graded assignments is to take the primary data set and translate it in a way that visualizes the thesis that you want to get across. The students love it. They're understanding now history is not just memorizing dates. It's actually trying to convey what you believe is important in the historical record and so forth. The faculty love it because the students are getting more excited about learning history. And all of this is being scaled by the fact that we're doing 15 of these grants every semester. So over the course of a few years, we'll literally have over 100 course sections that will now have these assignments embedded in them, getting students to pause, mostly gateway classes, to think about what you can do with the major. And so that the students record all this learning that's going on in their learning communities, in these gateway classes and elsewhere in the curriculum. Every student who comes into Georgia State now has a cloud-based e-portfolio that they're given and assigned right from their first matriculation. One of their assignments in their first orientation class is to use it. This is kind of like LinkedIn on steroids. It allows students to post not just text files, but also video files, audio files, be very creative about it and so forth. Last 12 months alone, Georgia State students have posted over 700,000 artifacts to their e-portfolios. And while it's a useful tool for employment, our students do have the ability to share these e-portfolios with potential internship or career employers. My goal and our goal in establishing this project was not so much to have the students share the content, but for the students to take some ownership in archiving and taking and understanding the career learning that they're already doing. Right? Because the students from their first semester are thinking about these issues and putting these pieces together and so forth, we think that they're going to be much better prepared for that first job interview when you're asked, well, what leadership experiences have you had? Instead of trying to remember back 3 years, they can turn to the e-portfolio and say, oh, this was a project I did in my history class and so forth. Just from making changes to the way we onboard students, the learning communities, the meta majors, these assignments in gateway classes, the e-portfolio, we have significantly changed voluntary behavior on the part of Georgia State students. Just 3 years ago, the most likely time a Georgia State student first visited University Career Services was in not only their last year with us, in their last semester with us. So they were first encountering University Career Services right before they graduated. Now, with these changes, the most common time a Georgia State student first visits University Career Services is in their first year with us. The students haven't changed that much over the last 3 years. We've changed the way we introduce them to topics and the way we bring them to be thinking about these issues. And what is the impact on that starting data point of the students moving between 2.5 majors? Well, we've also seen a significant decline in students who change their majors after the first year, a third less students doing so. And what you're going to see in a few minutes is this has a profound impact on average time to degree at Georgia State. Third example, I'll be quicker here. 43% is the percent of students receiving non-passing grades in introductory math courses a decade ago. Another disaster, especially if you enroll low-income students, because low-income students can't afford to take a required course their first semester, fail it, and then have to come back a semester or two later and do it all over again. In fact, because we have a big state scholarship in Georgia that requires students to maintain a 3.0 GPA in college, we were losing several hundred students a year just because of the math requirement. because students who pick up 2 Ds and Fs in their freshman year are not going to maintain a 3.0 GPA. And so these low-income students were coming in on the Hope Scholarship, losing the scholarship in their first year, and then walking away immediately because they didn't have the $6,000 to make up for the scholarship they just lost. So we've totally changed the way we deliver all introductory math courses at Georgia State. We offer no lecture hall sections any longer. We only offer hybrid adaptive sections. So students meet with their classmates in a classroom like this one, with their instructors in the room. They're all working at their own terminals on adaptive exercises, meaning the programs are gauging the level of competency of the student and adjusting the questions accordingly. So the slower students don't get left in the dust if they miss a basic concept, because the program will give them more foundational questions. The more advanced students don't get bored and tuned out because they're constantly getting more challenging questions. Every hour that a student is in one of these labs, they're getting about 100 bits of personalized feedback. Compared to the old model, which we stood by for generations at Georgia State, we'll bring students into classes of 50, 60, 75 at a time. If you're math phobic, you'll plant yourself in the last row of the class, slouch down and hope you never get called on all semester long. You'll listen to somebody talk about doing math 3 hours a week, and then we'll be surprised when on the midterm and final we finally ask you to do math that the results are not what we want them to be. Now the students are doing math 3 hours a week in this very structured setting. We're not quite where we want to be yet, but we've reduced the non-pass rates for the same material by 35%. And in fact, the success rates, as I'll show in a minute, for students who go on in STEM fields is much, much higher. That difference is about 1,300 more students a year passing math their first time out, rather than having to pay for it 2 or 3 times or even drop out. Because this works so well in math, our faculty on their own in the social sciences have initiated a large project to convert 15,000 seats of social science courses in economics, political science, and psychology to hybrid adaptive courses. Again, not something orchestrated from the university level. These are faculty saying, you know, it works well in math. We have the same problem in microeconomics. The students sit there passively, don't pick up the material. We think we can get better results if we deliver the material in this hybrid fashion. It's a lesson in being patient. So often in higher ed, we try something for a semester or 2 and then bail on it. Well, we tried this in small pilot levels starting in fall of 2017, and in a couple of courses, initially we got worse results for the hybrid sections than we did for the face-to-face sections. But we went back and looked at the data. We looked at which components of the course were working, which segments and subject matters were the students doing well in and which not well. We made changes to the way we deliver these courses, and now 2 years later, the students in the hybrid sections are outperforming the students in the face-to-face sections. And for the courses that are not going through pedagogical change, we have one of the largest near-peer tutoring programs in the country. I know you all do, and you need to. It's a great approach. For our case, in our instance, it's again data-based. We look at our data for the courses that trip up the most of our undergraduates, especially freshmen and sophomores. Then we look for students on work study who have done well in those same classes. If you have a sophomore who aced organic chemistry, don't have them working in your cafeteria. Pull them out, have them help other students figure out how to do organic chemistry, and that's just what we do. We pay the students now to go through training before the semester begins. We pay them to sit in on every course section of the course they've already passed, so they get totally integrated in the class, the students get to know them well, and they teach 3 instructional sessions each week, group tutoring sessions. We're tracking all the attendance via card swipes, and you can see some of the results. For students who attend at least 5 of these sessions, they're doing about half a letter grade better. Because it's worked so well, we had over 1,000 course sections at Georgia State last academic year that had a near-peer tutor embedded in the course all semester long. 2 more programs I'm going to describe. The first of the 2 started with this daunting number. 1,000 was the number of fully registered, academically qualified students we were dropping every semester because they failed to come up with the cost of their tuition and fees. 1,000 students a semester. It was devastating for my team, the student success team, because these are the success stories, right? These are students who get into majors and get through math and get to be enrolled, and they're academically qualified, and you're losing 1,000 of them a semester. Georgia has particularly harsh laws when it comes to dropping students who haven't covered the cost of their tuition and fees. We're required to drop them by the end of the 2nd week of classes if they haven't fully paid for their tuition and fees. And so again, we looked at the data. The most interesting thing we found among the 1,000 students we were dropping every semester is that the largest subgroup were seniors. Now, all of you are experts in student retention, and that defies at least one truism, which is freshmen are greater risk for retention than sophomores, sophomores than juniors. By the time of the senior year, these are good candidates for persistence, right? Because they've shown they can do college for 3 years, unless 60% of your students are low income. And what you have happening there is we looked at the data. It's not that these students were willfully leaving, and it's not that they were not academically qualified. They were running out of eligibility. That nice Hope Scholarship I was describing a moment ago, wonderful scholarship, covers 4 years, 8 semesters. You go one semester over, and 90% of our students are working students, so you've had one semester where you had to withdraw from a couple classes because of job or family or whatever. You're paying for it on your own. And when your average household income is about $25,000 a year, which is true of about 60% of our students, you're not getting that $3,000 or $4,000 from mom or dad or brother or sister or aunt or uncle. You're dropping out, stopping out, and hoping to earn the money and come back again. Well, how many of those students do so? Our numbers show if you stop out involuntarily from Georgia State, you have under a 30% chance of ever coming back and completing your degree. So starting in 2011, we didn't leave it for chance anymore, leave it to fate anymore. What we opened up was a program we call Panther Retention Grants. A critical part of the recipe for this program is students do nothing. Repeat that. Students do nothing. They do not have to raise their hand. They do not have to identify. They do not have to fill out an application. We have all the data. We know which students we're about to drop because they haven't paid us. We also know which students are academically qualified, which ones are close to graduation, and just how much they owe us. And so what we started doing in the fall 2011 is right before the drop, when otherwise these students would have been cleared from the roster at the end of the second week of classes, we instead picked students close to graduation with balances under $1,500 and just put the money in their account. $300, $500, $800, up to $1,500, just put it in their account. The first couple semesters we ran this program, we were calling the students immediately after giving them a grant saying, don't make plans Monday morning because we just covered, the gap you have and you're all set to go for the semester. Click. We had multiple students hanging up on us because they thought it was a scam. They didn't believe anybody from Georgia State had just put $800 or $900 into their account. But when you think about it for a moment, what more efficient use of institutional aid is there? So much of what Georgia State has done historically is put the limited aid we have on our freshmen, which is great. Again, I don't belittle any freshman scholarships, but these tend to be big packages. They're often meant to attract the most talented students and so forth. And there's a big risk with them because these students have no college track record whatsoever. Here you've got seniors who have 3 years of track record behind them, shown that they can be persistent and they've got grit and they'll stick with it and so forth. And you just need to get them across the finish line. Often they only need a couple more courses in order to graduate. Instead of letting these students walk away, we're now putting these grants in their account. And you can see the results. 12 months after, and with an average grant of $900, 86% of these students are walking across the stage with bachelor's degrees, as compared to under 30% who were eventually coming back and completing their degrees. And interesting things we see in the data, if you're a Georgia State senior and you have a C average or an A average, you have an equal chance, almost equal chance of graduating if allowed to do so. Right? But how many of us actually target those C students? How many of them actually, make an effort to try to say, this student is deserving as well? We had no program that was targeted to the students in these groups before. And because it's worked so well, we've scaled it immensely. We've now given over 15,000 of these Panther retention grants out over the last 6-7 years. You may ask, because Georgia State is not a flagship and not well-resourced and we don't have a large endowment, how we afford to give almost 16,000 of these grants out. The Gates Foundation asked the same question. They were interested in this program. They paid for Boston Consulting Group to come in and look at 6 years of our Panther retention grant data. They wrote a report. It's also available on our website. They came up with the conclusion this program runs in the black. It produces more revenue for the university than it costs us. Because we give the students on average $900, we immediately get back $900 because it's just what they owe us. But the average student who's gotten a $900 grant actually had a bill for that semester of about $2,800. So by giving them the $900, you not only get the $900 back again, you hold on to the $1,900 that they paid out of pocket or loans and so forth to try to get their balance down that otherwise is going to walk away from the university. And then some of these students end up coming back a subsequent semester as well. So here's a rare instance where doing the right thing is also doing, in a sense, the selfish thing, right? You can do right morally and still serve the, your institution's bottom line. The fifth and last program I'm going to talk about, but probably the biggest one, and maybe the one we're most known about at Georgia State, started with this number, 5,700. That was the number of students back 7-8 years ago who were dropping out in any given 12-month period. So this is a different group than the group we were just talking about. The previous group were fully registered, wanting to enroll, and then we were forcibly removing them because they didn't come up with the cost of tuition and fees. This is the group that most of us are very familiar but haunted by, the students who are enrolled one semester and just don't return, right? There's no office they go in to signal, oh, I'm dropping out. They're fully registered, they may be doing great, and then they just don't come back, and you send them emails and texts and so forth, and they don't come back, and after a year, you basically write them off as a dropout. So we asked a very simple question back in 2011. What would it look like for us to know who these students were, not after the fact, which was the status quo at the time, but how about 6 months, 12 months, even 24 months before they actually drop out? What are the early warning signs of a student who is going to drop out? So with the premise being that if we can discover the early warning signs, maybe we can intervene and help. So back in 2011, we began a big data project. This was before EAB had any technology platform. It was initially just a research study to try to see if we could figure out in the historical record what were the early warning signs of a student who was about to drop out of Georgia State. We used 10 years of our data, 2.5 million grades. The point was really simple. Could we find in the historical data any recurring student behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping or flunking out of the university? We postulated we'd find a few dozen. We actually found 800 different behaviors that correlated in a statistically significant way to students dropping out. And what we've been doing at Georgia State for more than 7 years now is tracking every single undergraduate every single night for every one of these risk factors. As we update our SIS and other data systems, we're looking for any of these behaviors. If one's identified, then the very next morning when the staff person assigned to that student, the academic advisor assigned to that student comes into the office, he or she will see in their work box a notice that one of your students over the last 24 hours committed a risky act, and they have 48 hours for an intervention. What kind of things are we tracking among these 800 alerts? Mostly just common sense stuff. Registration records. Here's the complicated pathway it takes a student at Georgia State to complete a BS in chemistry in the minimum of 4 years. And it's great for the students who follow the map. We've been handing these maps out for a decade. But the reality is when we look at our data, under 10% of our chemistry majors follow the map perfectly. They get off track. They're in the second semester, they take Math 2211, but the department says you need a B-, and they get a C+. And we had never recalibrated the map for the students. We had just expected our mostly first-generation low-income student body to figure it out. What do I do next? Well, maybe I'll ask a friend. But we weren't helping. In fact, we call this whole platform for the students GPS advising because we want them to think about it like the GPS in their cars. Used to be in the old days you would make a wrong turn when driving, didn't realize your mistake, get way off path, almost impossible to find your way to your destination, and at the very least you're going to be late. Now with GPS, you begin to make a wrong turn before you're even through the intersection. It's already recalibrating and giving you the new directions. That's just what we want this system to do for our students. You've made a wrong turn. Let's not make it worse by allowing you to go off path for 2 or 3 semesters. Let's get you right back on track again. So every single registration record is getting monitored, getting compared against the map. If there's a discrepancy, the student gets a reach out from an advisor who says, let's talk about what course you should be taking and in what order. The predictive analytics at the basis of the platform look like this. Really simple example, but these are actual Georgia State data. If you're a political science major at Georgia State, get an A or B in your first political science class, you're graduating on time from Georgia State at above a 75% clip, which is great for us. You get a C in that first class, you're graduating on time from Georgia State at a 25% clip. But what had we done for generations with that C student? Nothing. Worse than nothing, if you're a first-generation student, we mislead these students because we tell them, our academic policies tell them, you got the minimum grade you need in the prerequisite, now you're ready to go on, eligible to go on and take upper-level coursework in political science. Well, which one of us with a straight face could sit in front of a student and say, oh, you're eligible and ready to go on, and by the way, you'll have a 75% chance of failing once you do so. But that's just what we had been doing at Georgia State. Now an alert goes off as soon as that C grade is registered. There's an immediate intervention. The advisor will sit down with the student. Maybe they'll look at the papers and exams. Maybe they're reading and writing issues that need to be addressed. Maybe it's just the student's working 40 hours a week. But why don't we try to figure it out now rather than passively sitting by while the student digs him or herself in a deeper and deeper hole. And then we reach out a year later and say, oh, we see you've lost your scholarships and you've exhausted your eligibility, you're no longer compliant with SAP and so forth. The trick with this approach is to do it at scale. And over the last 12 months alone, just at our Atlanta campus, we've had over 60,000 one-on-one meetings between our advisors and students that were prompted by alerts coming out of the platform. We did not correct all 60,000 problems, but I can say that just 7 years ago, these were 60,000 issues that were going completely undiagnosed by Georgia State. Students were signing up for the wrong classes, they were underperforming in prerequisites, nobody was lifting a finger. We were expecting, again, our mostly first-generation low-income student body to have diagnostic powers that we lacked. Finally, we've taken some responsibility and are trying to help the students navigate. So we launched in the summer of 2012 this approach to advising using data. We immediately saw significant gains in retention. The biggest gains were not for our iPEDS freshmen. They were for our transfer students, our part-time students, our adult learners, our military learners. The students on all of our campuses who tend to sail under the radar screen are now getting tracked for 800 risk factors every day, and it's making a difference. They're getting these interventions in a timely fashion. I alluded to this earlier, but again, the correlation is striking. We launched in 2012, and since then, we have seen a significant drop in average time to degree. We've cut over half a semester off the time it takes the average Georgia State student to complete all their bachelor's requirement. We haven't lowered requirements by any measure whatsoever. The requirements remain exactly the same, but students are meeting the requirements more efficiently. They're finding the right major earlier on. They're passing their math course after one attempt rather than after three. They're registered for the right classes in the right order. And as a result, they're getting through their programs on average with 8 fewer wasted credit hours. And that may not sound like much. What it translates to is about $18 million in savings for this spring's graduating class alone, the graduating class of 19, compared to the graduating class the year before we launched the platform. And maybe the most surprising results of using predictive analytics advising are these. When we launched, most of our faculty and staff were supportive. There was a minority opinion at some of the faculty Senate meetings that postulated that what we were doing was, as they put it, creating a system for moving students to easier majors. The premise being, if we start advising all students by probabilities, they'll all end up gravitating towards the easiest majors and the easiest courses. Well, Georgia State may be the best test case for this whole theory nationally because we've been doing this now for 7 years. We've had over 500,000 interventions with students based on the predictive analytics. Over that time period, our 2 fastest growing majors are computer science and biology. Nobody thinks those are among the easiest majors at Georgia State. And every year since we've launched the platform, we've set new records for the number of STEM majors who are graduating with bachelor's degrees from Georgia State. Overall, we're up 117%, but I picked out a couple demographic categories that are often studied nationally for STEM completion, and these students are doing even better. So as you can see, we're up exponentially for our African American males and our Hispanic students in STEM degrees awarded, far outpacing increases in enrollments for those populations over the same time period. When we looked at our data more closely, another interesting finding. We have not had a significant increase in the number of students declaring STEM majors. We've had a significant decline in the number of students declaring STEM majors and wiping out after 2 semesters. We used to be perfectly happy to enroll a first-generation low-income student who says, I'm pre-med in organic chemistry, and we sat passively by while he struggled in calculus and failed organic chemistry. At the end of the first year, he had either dropped out or we were sitting down with him saying, you got to pick a different major because you failed all the required courses for organic chemistry. Now we have alerts going off as early as 3 and 4 weeks into the first semester. What might have been a D on a midterm, maybe it gets pulled up to a C+ and B-. And by the final, it's a B grade. And so the student is able and equipped to go on in the next semester. So in conclusion, let me pull together the collective impacts of these systematic changes that I've been describing this morning to you. The first change, and it was not one that we anticipated 10 years ago, is that it's changed the profile of Georgia State University. This was campus a little over a year ago. You may recognize the gentleman on the far right there. That's the side of the screen weighted more heavily by net worth. That's Bill Gates. When Bill Gates came to campus, we did not invite him. He was speaking at the World Congress Center in Atlanta on World Health, giving a big keynote address. And like 3 weeks before, his people call us up and said, Bill's been reading about what you've been doing with technology and data to help low-income students. Would you mind if he dropped by for a couple hours to learn more about what you're doing? We said just this once we'll allow it. But they were serious. He did not meet the president. It wasn't ceremony at all. He was laser focused. We had a room set up with the chatbot and the predictive analytics and some of our first generation students, and he spent 3 hours studying all the programs that I'm talking about with you this morning. And that's important for the morale and identity of a campus that was segregated, a generation ago, and now is being highlighted by somebody like Bill Gates. You heard in the introduction, I've had the honor now of speaking twice at the White House. President Obama cited the Panther retention grant program that I talked about a little earlier. Been a little quieter over the last 2.5 years. I don't know if anything's changed in D.C., but the White House has stopped calling. I don't know. But in all seriousness, this is not a politically divisive issue. The invitations to the White House were under the Obama White House, not the current White House. But I also had the honor of testifying in front of the U.S. Senate. That was at the invitation of the Republicans. They invited me. Whether you're all about social justice and equity, or you're all about workforce and tax bases and so forth, this is a win-win topic, right? We all want to see more students succeed and more students have much brighter careers and futures. Another change that we weren't necessarily anticipating that's come from all these initiatives is it's changed the financial footing of Georgia State University. Here's a down and dirty calculus you probably can do for your own campus. With over 30,000 students at the Atlanta campus, every 1 point we increase our retention rate, it brings almost 300 additional students who are enrolled. And so I went to our CFO and asked, what was the average bill that a Georgia State undergraduate paid to the university over the previous 12 months? And it's about $9,800. And there's the calculus for you. Every 1% we improve our retention and success rates, we're talking about $3 million of additional revenues that come into the university from tuition and fees. We have not improved our success rates by 1 point over the last decade. We've improved our success rates by 23 percentage points. So we're talking about $60 to $70 million. That $40 million cut in state appropriations I talked about a little while ago, it's been more than compensated for by the fact that we've been able to hold on to so many additional students. And it's this income that is paid for us expanding our advisors, buying new technology, launching the chatbot, and these other sorts of innovations. But I'm not only a religious studies faculty member, my field is ethics, so I have not been motivated by this screen as much as by this screen. That despite all those demographic shifts I started off describing, where over the last decade or so we've doubled the number of low-income students we enroll, we've doubled the number of non-white students that we've enrolled, our SAT scores are down by 33 points. We're graduating over 3,000 more students every year, a 73% increase. And if you look at where those gains have come from, these are our bachelor's degrees conferred by different demographic categories. They've come from all the students who struggled the most under the old system. So you haven't heard me once this morning mention the African-American male this, or the program just for our Pell students, or just for... What we've done is we've seen problems, we've made the changes systematically across the board. All the students get access to the chatbot, all the students come in learning communities, all the students have e-portfolios, all the students do adaptive math, and all the students are tracked for 800 risk factors every day. But when we've scaled those programs across every student, not surprisingly, the students who benefit the most are the students who are tripped up the most by the old bureaucracy. These are the students that don't have brothers and sisters and parents at home that are coaching them and giving them advice. And now that we're finally doing so, taking some responsibility for doing what we should have done all along and telling students, here's how you navigate this insane bureaucracy we've created for you, the students who struggle the most are doing disproportionately well. And what that means for graduation rates is the following. I started the presentation with the blue boxes when we were at 30% with the significant equity gaps. The graduation rates have not improved incrementally, they've improved exponentially. We've more than doubled our graduation rate for our African American students. We've tripled it now for African American males. We've almost tripled it for Hispanic students. And for each of the last 5 years in a row at Georgia State, our African American, our Hispanic, our first generation, and our Pell students have all graduated at or above the rate of the student body overall. So race, ethnicity, income level are no longer predictors of success at Georgia State. And this institution in the shadow of the Martin Luther King district that was segregated into the 1960s and grossly underperforming for our students of color as recently as a decade ago, now and for each of the last 6 years, has conferred more bachelor's degrees to African American students than any other college or university in the United States. And isn't that a more fitting tribute to this campus that sits there right in the middle of the Martin Luther King district than where we were just a short while ago? So let me close with one footnote. And then we may have time for one or two questions, and then I'm going to stay here and I'll do a breakout to answer your questions in much greater depth. The question I get most often on the road is, if this works so well at Georgia State, why isn't everybody doing it? Is this transferable? Do these approaches work in other instances? We've had a lot of partner schools that have worked with us. Some of them are in this room. And I do think there's impressive evidence that these approaches, which are nothing other than common sense delivered at scale, do transfer and work in a lot of other settings. But the state of Georgia gave us the best example of a test case 3 years ago when they consolidated with Georgia Perimeter College. Georgia Perimeter, a two-year institution that was failing in many ways, had big budget deficits and woefully low graduation rates. The IPEDS rates were 6.5% when we took over for a 3-year associate degree completion. But what we've been doing systematically but incrementally is rolling out the programs I've been describing at Georgia Perimeter College. And this is what the IPEDS numbers look like. We're not where we want to be yet, but we have now come close to tripling the IPEDS rate from the time just a little over 3 years ago when consolidation was first announced. About 60% of the students are either getting their associate's degrees or successfully transferring to bachelor's programs. And we had a funder in the state of Georgia, the State Farm Foundation, that asked us an interesting question over 2 years ago. They knew about consolidation with Perimeter, and they knew it would take us time to roll out the learning communities and the Panther grants and the analytics for all these students. So they said, what if we were to fund a campus so that the students on that particular campus get all these supports from the get-go? So we'll make sure that you can ramp up all these things right from the beginning. So we admitted a cohort at in South DeKalb County, our most economically distressed community college campus. 100% of the students in the cohort were underrepresented minorities. 100% of them were Pell eligible. We, this spring, hit the 2-year mark after their first enrollment in associate degree programs, and 85% of the students completed their associate degrees. And you know, if there's any overarching lesson I'd like to leave you with, yes, I hope there are practical tips you can take home and apply and adapt, and we're happy to support you in any efforts if you need more information. We've got a really good website, which is right there, has all kinds of documents and reports and third-party studies and so forth up there. But I hope that the lesson that you walk away with is a little broader than that. Because if anything, what Georgia State shows is your work is much more important than perhaps you've given yourselves credit for. You know, we've long been under the impression that these devastating equity gaps, you know, are the result of things that happen in pre-K or third grade reading scores or 8th grade math scores. And I don't doubt that data that shows those equity gaps emerge in those contexts, and we need to try to address those problems. But what Georgia State shows is, despite those equity gaps that exist as the students come into our campus, we have the power to do a lot more in reversing them. We have the power to finally deliver on the promise we've been making for generations to these students and their families, to offer them a better life, to offer them a trajectory that is very different. So thank you very much for your attention this morning, and thank you especially for the important work you do.
And I am going to have to be the bad guy and say we don't have time for a question in the big group, but he will be here in this room to follow up with any questions you have. Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you for being with us. Have a great day, everyone.